Okay, so we're talking about the respiratory anatomy today. So we're going to start in the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity has concha, which are easier on this model, and they're named superior, middle, and inferior conchas. Right? The meatus is just the tissue that overlies the concha. So I'd never ask you meatus and concha on the same question because they're pretty much interchangeable. Right? So air comes in through the nasal passages, and they're divided into the right and the left nasal cavity. The right and the left are divided by two different sets of bones, and the hyaline cartilage, which extends off the end, which is just called the nasal cartilage. The two bones, we're not seeing them in any of our little models, but remember the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, it sticks down into the nasal cavity, then the vomer comes up, and they join together, and then the hyaline cartilage comes off the head. So vomer and the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. If we're talking about the sinuses, we're talking about paranasal, para around nose, nasal, paranasal sinuses. This bone tells me what sinus this is. This is the frontal bone, so this is the frontal sinus. If I open this guy up, now I can see all these little holes or rounded areas. This is part of the ethmoid bone, so that's the ethmoid sinus. This bone back here, the sella turcica is here, so that tells me that this is the sphenoid bone, and therefore these are the perfect. There's one more paranasal sinus. You remember that one is maxillary, good. And you open up this bone in the front that connects to your teeth is the maxilla, and that hole is the maxillary sinus. Couldn't see it, I was too close. All right. If we're talking about the throat, so we're moving from the nasal cavity into the oral cavity. You've got the tongue, you've got some glands, you've got the teeth in the front. Part of the maxillary bone is the hard palate. So if you stick your tongue up on the roof of your mouth, you can feel it's hard. That's the hard palate portion. It's made up of the palatine process of the maxillary bone and the palatine bones. Remember those two little tiny bones at the roof of the mouth. And then extending off of it is mucosa with a little bit of muscle, and that would be the soft palate, all the way in the back of your throat. This little part that's hanging down, if you look into your mouth, open up your mouth and look in, you can see this little thing hanging down the midline. That little guy is called the uvula. When we swallow, the uvula pops up and blocks food and air, or food and water, from going up into the nasal cavity. Some people can squirt milk out of their nose, and that's what's happening. They're causing more pressure than the uvula can stand, and so the fluid comes up into the nose. That's also what happens when you have fluid coming out of your eye, right? Because the lacrimal glands of the eye, you remember from our special senses anatomy, the lacrimal glands sit on the lateral aspect of the eye, superior and lateral. So when we cry, tears come down and wash over the eye, and then they go down this little duct called the lacrimal duct through the lacrimal sinus. And that's why when you cry, your nose runs, because it empties into your nasal cavities. All right, so moving from the nasal cavity to the oral cavity, we can see some tonsils that we talked about last week. This is the pharyngeal tonsil. Down here are the palatine tonsils, and then under the tongue there's a lingual tonsil. I'm not seeing the lingual tonsil because they're going to call these sublingual glands probably. So we have the back of the throat, and then guarding the airway and the esophagus is the epiglottis. This epiglottis is special because it's made out of a different type of cartilage than all the rest of them. Right? This nasal cartilage was made out of hyaline cartilage. The thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage, which we can't see, are made out of hyaline cartilage. But this little guy is made out of a different type of cartilage. Elastic. Ears, epiglottis, elastic. So this is the airway, or the larynx, and the back of the throat is called the pharynx. The back of the throat is associated with the nose. It's called the nasopharynx. If it's associated with the oral cavity, it's called the oropharynx. And if it's associated back here with the larynx, it's called the laryngopharynx. So 3 different parts: nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. From there, food and water passes down to the stomach through the esophagus. Air passes this way. Now, how do we get food and stuff from this area down into the esophagus? What has to happen? The epiglottis, which is sitting here, flops down like that and protects the airways. Airways, or the larynx, contain the false vocal cords and the true vocal cords. The false vocal cords are just mucosa that sit on top of the true vocal cords, and the true vocal cords are the ones that vibrate when we talk, and that produces sound. So air this way, food this way. Got it? Good? All right, you can see similar things in this one, right? Superior and inferior nasal, superior, inferior, try that again. Superior middle, inferior concha, frontal sinuses, don't see ethmoid sinuses, sphenoid sinuses, still see the soft palate and the uvula, hard palate, maxillary bone. We see the oral cavity, we see the pharyngeal tonsils, the palatine tonsils, the lingual tonsils. Still have our epiglottis. It still flops down to let food go down the epiglottis. And we see false ones are on the top. And the true ones are white. They are avascular. So that's why they're white. And then the larynx proper. Nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. There's a nice little picture in your book that has them in different colors. All right.